I take everything like that with a pinch of salt, really, because you can't say who's best.
In the world of rock and roll, few figures command the same level of admiration and mystique as Brian May, the legendary guitarist of Queen. Known for his astrophysics PhD, his handmade red special guitar, and his gentle, almost scholarly demeanor, May has long been perceived as the refined intellectual of the music industry. A soft-spoken genius, more interested in harmony than hostility. But behind that curtain of humility and poise, insiders knew there was a fiercely judgmental mind cataloging every note, every trend, and every guitarist who dared stand on the same stage of acclaim. May wasn't loud with his opinions, but they were surgical, calculated, and sometimes devastating. He believed that guitar playing wasn't just performance. It was architecture, mathematics, and emotion woven into sonic structures. And those who failed to treat it with that level of reverence, he remembered them. Quietly, and when the moment was right, he didn't hold back. What shocked the music world wasn't that Brian May had opinions, but that some of those opinions bordered on contempt. Over the years, whispers grew louder. Stories of May refusing to participate in guitarist rankings, of him walking away, from industry panels, of him dissecting fellow musicians with the clinical precision of a scientist unhappy with flawed data. In private conversations and interviews tucked away in niche music magazines, he began to drop hints, and slowly the world began to understand. Brian May harbored deep resentment toward a specific group of musicians, not because they played poorly, not because they were talentless, but because, in his eyes, they corrupted the essence of what the guitar was supposed to be. Whether it was through artificial personas, soulless technical feats, or the glorification of simple tricks over complex thought, these artists triggered something fierce in May, an academic wrath that revealed a completely different side of the Queen guitarist. This wasn't about competition. This was about philosophy. And in today's episode, we pull back the curtain to expose the 6 musicians who, according to May's own words and the testimonies of those around him, were the targets of his intellectual fury. Prepare for a rare glimpse into the darker, more calculating mind of one of rock's greatest composers, a man who saw through the glitz, the hype, and the pyrotechnics, and instead judged music with the cold precision of a scholar. These are the 6 guitarists Brian May reportedly couldn't stand, and the reasons might just change how you view your favorite legends forever. To understand why Brian May developed such intense criticisms of certain guitarists, we must first understand the foundation of his own musical philosophy, a belief system rooted not in stardom or technical dazzle, but in structure, purpose, and emotional resonance. May wasn't just a musician, he was a scientist of sound. With a doctorate in astrophysics and a deep understanding of acoustics, he approached guitar composition as both an art and an equation. While other guitarists chased popularity with flashy solos or brute speed, May was layering harmonies, crafting guitar orchestras, and meticulously designing tonal journeys that supported Queen's theatrical storytelling. In his mind, the guitar wasn't a toy or a vehicle for ego. It was a symphonic instrument with infinite possibilities. Every note had to serve a purpose. Every riff had to enhance the emotion of the song. And anything less was a betrayal of the instrument's potential. His legendary quote to a journalist in 1982 summed it up best. "Some people hit notes, others create architecture." For May, the difference was fundamental. One was noise, the other was meaning. It wasn't that he hated innovation, he had pioneered plenty of it himself. It was that he loathed when innovation was used as a gimmick, rather than a tool of narrative and emotion. As guitar magazines in the 1980s and 1990s began shifting focus from musicality to sheer speed, ranking players on how many notes they could shred per second, May became increasingly disillusioned. To him, this was like turning poetry into a typing contest. He once scoffed, "Speed without purpose is just musical masturbation." a harsh but revealing phrase that encapsulated his distaste for hollow virtuosity. His contempt wasn't always spoken publicly, but behind the scenes, industry figures recounted stories of May dismissing rising stars with scalpel-sharp critiques, calling them actors, technicians, and formulaic robots. He didn't care if they were popular. He cared if they had depth. He didn't measure greatness in applause but in architectural integrity. This is why his frustrations often surfaced not in interviews but in actions. Declining invites to fastest guitarist contests, refusing photo ops with glamorized bad boys of rock, and privately dissecting albums with brutal precision. As the landscape of rock evolved and became increasingly commercialized, May stood as a stubborn intellectual purist, resisting the tide. And in that resistance, he made enemies, not with personal attacks, but with damning philosophies that cut to the core of what music should be. It was this unwavering belief in artistic rigor that shaped his disdain for 6 particular guitarists. To May, they didn't just fail to live up to the potential of the instrument, they twisted it into something it was never meant to be. And that was a sin he could not forgive. When Brian May first encountered the meteoric rise of Yngwie Malmsteen in the mid-1980s, he wasn't awestruck like most of the music world. Instead, he was deeply disturbed. While critics and fans hailed Malmsteen as the next evolutionary leap in guitar playing, a neoclassical speed demon whose arpeggios could melt the fretboard, May saw something far more troubling: a complete abandonment of emotional storytelling in favor of finger gymnastics. The Swedish virtuoso's lightning-fast solos might have dazzled on the surface, but to May, they rang hollow, devoid of soul, melody, or purpose. According to former Polydor Records executive Chris Wright, May once analyzed Malmsteen's albums meticulously and dismissed them with the brutal analogy, "He can play 1,000 notes per minute, but he's saying absolutely nothing with any of them." It's like watching someone recite the phone book at superhuman speed. That comment encapsulated May's entire philosophy. Music wasn't about how much you could play, but why you played it. What truly infuriated May was how the industry began redefining greatness not by what guitarists communicated, but by how fast their fingers moved. He referred to this shift as a betrayal of the guitar's purpose. Malmsteen's brand of athletic guitar playing, as May reportedly called it, was an insult to the kind of compositional depth May spent years perfecting within Queen's sonic landscapes. Where May orchestrated symphonic textures from his guitar, Malmsteen shredded scales at breakneck speed with little regard, in May's view, for emotional development or thematic progression. In a 1987 interview with Guitar Player magazine, May doubled down. "Speed without purpose is just musical masturbation." This wasn't mere jealousy. It was philosophical warfare. May believed that Malmsteen's approach celebrated technique over truth, noise over nuance, and ultimately pushed guitar music into an arena where depth was punished and spectacle was rewarded. His frustration only deepened when music publications began compiling lists of fastest guitarists, reducing decades of compositional brilliance into a numbers game. At one 1988 industry convention, May refused to join a panel on this very topic, telling organizers he'd rather be remembered for one meaningful melody than a million meaningless scales. That statement wasn't just a jab at Malmsteen, it was a manifesto. For May, guitar playing was sacred, and Malmsteen's technical exhibitions were, in his eyes, a form of desecration. This wasn't about differing tastes. It was a fundamental conflict over what guitar music was supposed to be. And in that ideological battle, Yngwie Malmsteen stood as the first name on Brian May's private blacklist. Brian May's disdain for Guns N' Roses guitarist Slash wasn't rooted in musical genre or playing ability. It was rooted in what May perceived as a betrayal of authenticity. In the late 1980s, as Slash emerged as the poster child for rebellious rock guitarists, May watched with mounting skepticism. To the public, Slash was the embodiment of raw, untamed rock and roll energy. The top hat, the cigarette, the cascade of unruly curls hiding his face while he shredded bluesy riffs. But to May, it was all an elaborate costume, a carefully constructed persona engineered to sell records, not express truth. According to former Geffen Records marketing director Al Corey, May privately studied Slash's image and media presence, ultimately concluding, "Saul's playing a character he invented. For the cameras, the hat, the hair, the cigarettes, it's all costume drama designed to sell rebellion instead of earn it." That single line encapsulated everything May detested about the commercialization of guitar culture. He had grown up crafting his identity, organically, from shy science student to rock innovator, through decades of painful trial, discovery, and artistic struggle. Slash, on the other hand, appeared to May as someone who had conjured a fully formed rock icon from thin air and turned it into a marketable product. May didn't question Slash's talent. He questioned his motives. The problem wasn't the playing, it was the performance surrounding it. He referred to it as designer danger, suggesting Slash was less a musician and more an actor playing a part. This belief reached a breaking point at a 1990 guitar exhibition where Slash and May were both present. Witnesses claimed May refused to be photographed with Slash, later telling his publicist, "I won't validate someone who's turned guitar playing into method acting." It wasn't personal. It was philosophical. May saw Slash as the symbol of everything wrong with the evolving music industry. Image over integrity, branding over substance. His concern deepened when young aspiring guitarists began copying Slash's look and attitude, mimicking not just the music but the myth. To May, this wasn't inspiration. It was infection. It diluted the seriousness of the craft and shifted focus from sound to spectacle. What made this rivalry unique was that Slash himself never seemed aware, or perhaps never cared, about May's critique. He continued building his legend while May seethed in quiet opposition, refusing to lend credibility to what he saw as an illusion. For May, Slash wasn't just a guitarist. He was a commercial product, a constructed archetype that traded in rebellion but never earned it. And in the eyes of a man who built his guitar by hand and treated music like science, that was unforgivable. 2. The average listener, Steve Vai's guitar playing, is a breathtaking display of precision, control, and experimental brilliance. But to Brian May, it was something far colder, a technically perfect shell lacking the emotional soul that defines truly great music. Vai, a graduate of the prestigious Berklee College of Music and former student of Joe Satriani, represented to May the institutionalization of creativity, the codification of art into curriculum, and the transformation of instinctive musical expression into mechanical execution. According to Relativity Records producer Mike Varney, May once described Vai's playing as exactly what his professors taught him, adding, "But there's no personal journey in any of it." May didn't reject education. He was a physicist after all. But when it came to music, he believed the greatest innovations came from raw experimentation, from trial, failure, and emotional risk. He built his own guitar from scraps, discovered tone through obsession, and forged a sound that no teacher could replicate because it wasn't taught. It was felt. In contrast, Vai's surgically precise technique and dazzling fretboard mastery felt to May like musical exercises rather than storytelling. At a 1989 educational seminar, when music schools began formally integrating Vai's systematic approach into their guitar programs, May questioned the entire premise, reportedly telling attendees, "Learning rules before learning feelings produces musicians who sound like textbooks instead of human beings." It wasn't that Vai lacked skill. He had an abundance of it. But May felt that skill alone wasn't music. It was a tool, not a destination. Vai, in his view, represented a new wave of guitarists who were trained to impress rather than connect. Their music was built for admiration, not emotion, and for May, that signaled the death of musical intimacy. He believed that true guitar playing should be an emotional conversation, not a recital. He saw Vai's meticulously structured solos as soulless constructions that evoked awe but failed to stir the heart. He once referred to it as conservatory correctness, a style so polished it lost its edge. While Vai's albums climbed charts and his instructional DVDs became gospel in music schools, May remained quietly resistant, never directly attacking Vai, but making his position clear through interviews and industry conversations. His critiques were rarely about personality. They were philosophical declarations about what music should mean. Vai, for his part, seemed unfazed, proudly embracing his role as a torchbearer of academic guitar mastery. But in May's view, that was the very problem. When music becomes homework, it loses its magic. Steve Vai didn't just play differently from Brian May. He believed in a completely different universe of music. And for May, that universe was sterile, synthetic, and antithetical to the emotional chaos that makes music matter. Among all the guitarists Brian May reportedly took issue with, none symbolized his deepest philosophical disagreement more than Joe Satriani. The friction between the two wasn't personal or even stylistic. It was conceptual. Satriani, an undisputed master of instrumental guitar work, had made a name for himself by removing vocals from the equation entirely, allowing his guitar to sing, weep, and roar in place of the human voice. But to Brian May, this artistic choice stripped music of its most essential communicative element, the lyrics and voice that ground the emotional journey. May saw Satriani's instrumental albums not as emotionally liberating expressions, but as clinical guitar showcases, beautiful yet disconnected, technically brilliant but fundamentally flawed in their purpose. According to Relativity Records executive Cliff Cultreri, May once remarked after listening to Satriani's albums, "Joe's created beautiful guitar landscapes, but he's removed the human voice that gives music its emotional anchor. It's like building a house without installing any doors." That metaphor reveals everything about May's worldview. Music wasn't just art or craft. It was a conversation. And without a human voice, Satriani's compositions spoke only to a select few rather than to the world. May's concern deepened as Satriani's instrumental work climbed charts and dominated guitar-centric circles in the late 1980s and early 1990s. To May, this represented a dangerous shift. Music was becoming an echo chamber for musicians, rather than an emotional vehicle for the masses. He believed guitar should enhance and serve a song's lyrical message, not replace it. In a 1990 interview with Guitar World, May said, "Guitar should serve the song's emotional message, not become the entire conversation," a direct shot at the rising trend of purely instrumental rock. May viewed Satriani's decision to discard vocals as an abandonment of emotional accessibility in favor of niche artistic expression, and he worried this would lead future musicians down the same isolating path. At a 1991 music conference, May publicly questioned the trend, stating, "We're creating music for musicians instead of music for people, which defeats the entire purpose of popular music." For Satriani, who had built his identity around musical storytelling without words, this critique likely felt misplaced. But for May, it was a matter of principle. He believed the guitar was a supporting actor, not the entire cast, and that songs, without lyrics, often lacked the grounding necessary to evoke true empathy from the listener. Satriani's approach, though technically sophisticated and emotionally nuanced in its own right, came across to May as self-indulgent, a private language spoken between virtuosos that left everyday listeners behind. This wasn't a dismissal of Satriani's talent. In fact, May acknowledged it many times, but rather an indictment of his artistic priorities. In May's world, the most powerful songs were those where every note, lyric, and inflection worked together to tell a story. that resonated universally. Satriani's choice to isolate the guitar as the sole narrator represented, to May, a narrowing of that potential, a retreat from communication into abstraction. That made Joe Satriani, in Brian May's eyes, not a pioneer, but a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when the pursuit of instrumental perfection overshadows the purpose of human connection. Among the most painful rivalries Brian May ever harbored, his grudge against Eddie Van Halen was perhaps the most personal and emotionally charged. The root of this resentment wasn't rooted in Eddie's talent. May acknowledged Van Halen's revolutionary skills, but in the fact that Van Halen received massive recognition for a narrow technique, finger tapping, while May's own groundbreaking innovations in guitar orchestration were largely overlooked by critics and publications. The disparity in recognition gnawed at May for years. While Eddie dazzled audiences with his energetic stage presence and finger acrobatics, May quietly engineered sonic symphonies using layers of harmonized guitar, constructing multi-instrumental illusions with just 6 strings and a homemade guitar. According to Warner Bros. Executive Ted Templeman, May once confided, "Eddie gets praised for one flashy technique while I've been revolutionizing guitar orchestration for years without anyone noticing." The media loves simple tricks more than complex innovations. May wasn't bitter about Eddie's success. He was bitter about the system that praised surface-level spectacle over deep compositional mastery. His frustration deepened when Van Halen's Eruption was hailed as the most important guitar solo of a generation. May, who had been pioneering multi-layered arrangements for a decade prior, felt sidelined. He referred to Van Halen's style as one-trick wizardry, a brilliant gimmick that impressed crowds but, in May's view, did little to push the boundaries of what guitar could accomplish musically. In a 1981 interview with guitar player, May stated, "Real innovation should expand what guitar can accomplish musically, not just what it can do physically," subtly criticizing Van Halen's emphasis on flash-over form. This tension culminated at a 1982 Industry Awards event, where May reportedly avoided Van Halen's table, later lamenting to his manager, "He gets credit for being revolutionary while I get called competent." History remembers the showman, not the architect. That line revealed the core of May's discontent. He felt invisible in a system that valued performance over blueprint. Van Halen, on the other hand, seemed unaware of May's quiet contempt and even praised Queen's guitar arrangements in interviews. But for May, Eddie's meteoric rise and media adoration were constant reminders that spectacle had eclipsed sophistication. It wasn't envy, it was disappointment. May had hoped that the industry would reward thoughtfulness, structure, and intellectual design. Instead, it celebrated speed, flair, and spontaneity. And that shift represented a personal betrayal. Eddie Van Halen was a genius in his own right, but in Brian May's eyes, he was also a symbol of an era that chose fireworks over architecture, and that was a legacy May could never applaud. At the top of Brian May's private list of grievances stood a name that surprised many, Jimmy Page, the revered mastermind of Led Zeppelin. But for May, Page wasn't just a peer. He was the personification of the critical double standard that haunted May's entire career. While Page was universally celebrated for his blues-driven guitar arrangements and atmospheric mystique, May's equally complex and often more harmonically advanced work with Queen was dismissed as theatrical or pop. This disparity in recognition infuriated May, who believed he was operating on a higher architectural level musically yet being overshadowed by a player rooted in pentatonic blues. According to former EMI executive Ken Townsend, May once said, "Jimmy gets called a genius for blues-based arrangements while my symphonic guitar orchestrations get ignored because they're attached to sing-along choruses." Academic snobbery is destroying objective musical assessment. May viewed himself as a musical scientist, fusing rock with harmony, orchestration, and mathematical precision. Page, by contrast, was, at least in May's mind, simpler, more primal, and yet more glorified. May believed the only reason critics elevated Page above him was genre bias. Led Zeppelin's work, often darker and rooted in American blues traditions, was deemed serious art, while Queen's genre-hopping theatrical hits were branded as clever entertainment. The tipping point came when Page was regularly ranked above May in greatest guitarist lists, despite May's more elaborate harmonic techniques. He reportedly referred to Page's arrangements as primitive blues extensions that sound complex, but follow basic patterns any intermediate player could master. While Page remained gracious and silent in public, May's criticisms grew sharper behind closed doors. He told critic Charles Shar Murray, "Blues gets called art, while pop gets called craft, regardless of actual compositional complexity," lamenting a music world that mistook minimalism for depth. In Page, May saw the ultimate academic injustice, a man who reaped scholarly praise for simpler ideas, while more sophisticated constructions were dismissed as superficial because they had mass appeal. For May, that wasn't just unfair. It was proof that musical criticism had failed. Page's influence was undeniable, but in Brian May's view, it came at the cost of more deserving innovation being ignored. This wasn't mere rivalry. It was a wound that festered for decades. Page didn't just get the spotlight. He got the validation May had always craved. And in the deepest corners of May's mind, that made Jimmy Page the most unforgivable name on his list. In the end, the story of Brian May's intellectual grudges against 6 legendary guitarists, Yngwie Malmsteen, Slash, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Eddie Van Halen, and Jimmy Page, isn't simply about rivalry or resentment. It's about a man who saw music not as mere entertainment but as a form of structural expression, a fusion of emotion, physics, and philosophy. May's critiques weren't born from hatred. They were born from disappointment, from a deep-seated conviction that the art form he devoted his life to was being cheapened, glamorized, or misunderstood. He watched as speed was mistaken for depth, as image overtook authenticity, and as complexity was devalued in favor of spectacle. And though he rarely expressed these views in bombastic interviews or public feuds, they seeped through in his comments, his refusals, and his quiet but unflinching assessments of his contemporaries. Each of the 6 guitarists he reportedly despised represented, to May, a different kind of threat to the integrity of music. Malmsteen's speed for speed's sake, Slash's commercial persona, Vai's academic sterility, Satriani's emotional disconnect, Van Halen's media-obsessed flash, and Page's overpraised simplicity. What's fascinating is that May never outright attacked any of them in public. He wielded his critique with the same surgical precision he brought to his music. He didn't argue, he observed. He didn't insult, he dissected. And in those dissections we glimpse not just bitterness, but a desperate desire for music to be respected as an intellectual and emotional craft, not just a flashy performance. May wasn't just defending his legacy, he was defending a philosophy, one where every note carries weight, every composition tells a story, and every performance means something beyond applause. But here's the twist. In voicing these frustrations, did May reveal himself as a purist guardian of musical artistry, or as a man consumed by the very need for validation he so often disdained in others? It's possible that both are true, that the same mind capable of composing the layered brilliance of Bohemian Rhapsody and the Prophet's Song could also be plagued by the nagging injustice of being perpetually underrated by an industry that praised flashover form, that behind the soft-spoken humility of Queen's quiet genius was a firestorm of suppressed critique, sharpened by years of watching less nuanced players dominate headlines and Hall of Fame lists. And maybe that duality is what makes Brian May so compelling. Not just a guitarist, not just a composer, but a philosopher of sound navigating a world that often didn't speak his language. In the battle between depth and dazzle, structure and spontaneity, May stood firmly on one side. Whether you see that as visionary insight or wounded pride depends on your view of music itself. But one thing is clear: even the gentlest geniuses carry scars, and sometimes those scars speak louder than the notes they play.